You ever notice how some headlines just grab you by the collar and shake you a little? Like they're trying to tell you something really big, but they're also trying to get a rise out of you at the same time. Well, something caught my attention lately that did exactly that. It was one of those headlines that screamed, "Trump rages. Canada's $20 billion battery deal exposes America's electric car crisis." Now, if you're anything like me, your first thought might be, whoa, hold on. $20 billion in Canada? And what's this about an American electric car crisis? It's a lot to unpack, right? It's not just a simple news story. It's a whole tangled mess of economics, politics, technology, and frankly, a bit of national pride. And it really makes you think about where we're headed with this whole electric vehicle revolution. Let's start with the Canada part, because that's a pretty big piece of the puzzle. We're talking about some serious money flowing north of the border. Specifically, there's this company called PowerCo, which is a subsidiary of Volkswagen. And they're not just dabbling, they're building what they call a gigafactory for batteries in St. Thomas, Ontario. We're talking about an investment that's actually over 20 billion euros, which, depending on the exchange rate on any given day, is roughly 21.5 billion US dollars. That's not chump change, folks. That's a monumental investment. And the goal? To crank out enough batteries for up to 3 million electric vehicles every single year. 3 million! Think about that scale for a second. It's like they're building the battery equivalent of a small country's entire car production. And it's not just Volkswagen. Stellantis, another huge automaker, also has a deal for a battery factory up in Windsor, Canada. And guess what? The Canadian government is throwing a lot of support behind these projects. They're rolling out the red carpet, offering incentives, making it attractive for these massive companies to set up shop right there. It's a strategic play, a big bet on the future of electric vehicles, and frankly, it looks like Canada is winning big in this particular race for battery manufacturing dominance. They're positioning themselves as a global hub for EV battery production, and they're doing it with serious capital and government backing. Now, here's where the exposes America's electric car crisis part of that headline comes in. Because while Canada is celebrating these massive investments, there's a growing narrative, especially in the US, that our own electric vehicle market is, well, hitting a bit of a speed bump, or maybe even a wall, depending on who you ask. You hear terms like cooling off or crisis being thrown around, and honestly, it's not entirely unfounded. Think about it. A few years ago, it felt like everyone was talking about going electric. The hype was through the roof. Teslas were everywhere, and every major automaker was announcing ambitious plans to go all electric by X date. But then reality started to set in for a lot of everyday consumers. What are some of the big sticking points? Well, first off, the cost. Electric vehicles, especially new ones, are still pretty expensive for the average American family. We're talking about prices that can easily push past $50,000, $60,000, even $70,000 for a lot of models. And while there are tax credits, they can be confusing, and not everyone qualifies, or they don't get the full amount. It's a big chunk of change, especially when interest rates are high and people are already feeling the pinch from inflation. Then there's the charging infrastructure. This is a huge one, and honestly, it's probably the biggest hurdle for a lot of people. You know how it is when you're on a road trip and you just pull off the highway, fill up your tank in 5 minutes, and you're back on the road. With an EV, it's a different ballgame. Public charging stations can be scarce in some areas, they can be slow, sometimes they're broken, and the payment systems can be a nightmare. Range anxiety is a real thing. Imagine you're driving to visit family a few states away, and you're constantly looking at your battery percentage, wondering if you'll make it to the next charger, or if that charger will even be available or working when you get there. It's not the seamless experience that most gas car owners are used to. And for people who live in apartments or don't have a garage, home charging isn't always an easy option either. And let's not forget about the batteries themselves. The cost of replacing an EV battery down the line? That's a huge unknown for many consumers, and it's a pretty scary prospect. We're talking thousands, potentially tens of thousands of dollars. It's not like replacing a muffler. And then there's the depreciation.
Some studies and anecdotal evidence suggest that used electric vehicles are depreciating faster than their gasoline counterparts. That's a tough pill to swallow if you're thinking about resale value. Nobody wants to buy a car that's going to lose a huge chunk of its value in just a few years.
So when you put all that together, the high upfront cost, the charging headaches, the battery replacement fears, the depreciation, it starts to paint a picture of a market that's perhaps not as ready for a full-scale EV takeover as some of the early evangelists might have hoped. It's not that people don't want to go electric, it's that the practicalities and the economics aren't quite lining up for a lot of folks right now. It's like when the first smartphones came out. They were cool, but they were expensive, the apps were limited, and the battery life was terrible. It took time for the technology and the infrastructure to catch up to the vision. By the way, if you're enjoying this kind of deep dive into how global economics and technology intersect with our everyday lives, definitely stick around. I explore stuff like this pretty regularly, and I think you'll find a lot more to chew on. Now, let's bring Donald Trump into this, because his rage is a key part of that headline. Trump has a long, well-documented history of being critical of trade deals, of imposing tariffs, and of pushing an America First agenda. He's been particularly vocal about protecting American industries and jobs, often through tariffs on imported goods. We saw it with steel and aluminum. We saw it with certain automotive parts. And he's often targeted Canada in these disputes. Back in March of 2025, Canada actually announced 25% tariffs on over $20 billion worth of U.S. products. Why? Because they were retaliating against tariffs that Trump had imposed on their steel and aluminum. It's like a trade war, a tit-for-tat, where each side tries to hit the other where it hurts economically. And more recently, in June of 2025, there were reports that Trump was furious with Canada, specifically over the idea of them implementing 50% tariffs. 50%! That's a massive tax on goods, and it would impact a whole range of industries, including the automotive sector. Here's the thing. Trump's policies, particularly these tariffs, can absolutely make things more expensive for American consumers. If you put a 25% or 50% tariff on imported parts or finished vehicles, that cost gets passed on. So if you're trying to buy an electric car, and some of its components or even the entire vehicle comes from a country that's now subject to these tariffs, the price tag goes up. It's basic economics. And that, in turn, could exacerbate the electric car crisis by making EVs even less affordable for the average American. Honestly, I think this is where the headline really hits home.
Canada is making these massive, strategic investments in battery production, securing its place in the future of the automotive industry. Meanwhile, the U.S. market is struggling with adoption, and a potential Trump presidency could bring back policies that, in my view, might actually make the problem worse by increasing costs through tariffs. It's a fascinating contrast, isn't it? One country leaning into global supply chains and attracting foreign investment, the other potentially retreating behind protectionist walls. A lot of folks don't talk about this, but the city of Toronto in Canada actually went so far as to exclude Tesla vehicles from their electric car incentives. Why? Because of the trade tensions with the US and Trump's stance. It's a direct consequence. It shows how these high-level political and economic decisions trickle down and affect everything, even what kind of incentives you can get for buying an EV in a specific city. It's not just abstract policy, it's real-world impact. Now, let's reflect on this for a moment. Is this truly a crisis for America's electric car market, or is it just a natural market correction? I mean, we saw a huge surge of enthusiasm, almost a gold rush mentality around EVs. Everyone wanted to be first, everyone wanted to claim the future. But sometimes the initial hype outpaces the practical realities. Maybe what we're seeing now isn't a crisis, but a necessary recalibration. A moment where the market is saying, hey, we need more affordable options, better charging, and more clarity on long-term costs before we fully commit. I know some people see it differently. They might argue that the EV market is still growing, just not at the breakneck speed it was a year or two ago. They might point to new models coming out, improvements in battery technology, and more charging stations being built. And they're not wrong. There is progress. But the narrative of a slowdown or crisis comes from a place of genuine concern about the pace of adoption and the challenges consumers are facing. It's not just a manufactured talking point, it's based on sales figures and consumer surveys. Here's the thing though. When you look at Canada's aggressive move to secure battery manufacturing, it really highlights a potential vulnerability for the US. If we're not producing enough batteries domestically, we become reliant on other countries. And in a world where supply chains are increasingly weaponized, that's a risky position to be in.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Are we truly prioritizing the long-term strategic independence of our EV supply chain, or are we getting bogged down in short-term political skirmishes? In my view, the Trump rages part of the headline isn't just about his personal temperament. It's about a fundamental disagreement on economic philosophy. On one side, you have a more globalist approach, where countries like Canada are actively seeking international investment and integrating into global supply chains. On the other, you have a more nationalist, protectionist approach championed by Trump, which prioritizes domestic production and often uses tariffs as a tool to achieve that. But here's what most people don't realize. Tariffs, while they might sound good on paper for protecting domestic jobs, often have unintended consequences. They can raise prices for consumers, make American products less competitive globally if other countries retaliate, and they can disrupt complex supply chains that have been built over decades. It's like trying to fix a leaky faucet by turning off the water to the entire house. You might stop the leak, but you've created a whole new set of problems. Think of it like this. You know how when you're trying to build a really complex Lego set and you realize you're missing a crucial piece, and that piece is only made in one specific factory across the ocean? Now imagine a tariff is slapped on that piece. Suddenly, your entire Lego set becomes more expensive, or you can't finish it at all. That's a simplified analogy, but it gets to the heart of how tariffs can mess with global manufacturing. This whole situation makes me reflect on the broader implications for the future of transportation and energy. We're in a global race, not just for who builds the most EVs, but who controls the entire ecosystem, from mining the raw materials to processing them, to manufacturing the batteries, to assembling the cars, and finally to building out the charging infrastructure. Canada is making a strong play for a significant piece of that pie. And the US, while it has its own strengths, seems to be grappling with some fundamental questions about its strategy. I worry that if we don't address the core issues of EV affordability and charging infrastructure in the US, and if we layer on protectionist policies that further increase costs, we risk falling behind. It's not just about what kind of cars we drive, it's about economic competitiveness, national security, and our role in the global economy of the future.
What would you do in a situation like that? If you were advising the US government, would you double down on tariffs, hoping to force manufacturing back home? Or would you focus on massive investments in charging infrastructure, consumer incentives, and perhaps even collaborate more closely with allies like Canada to build a robust North American supply chain? Honestly, I think the latter approach makes a lot more sense in the long run. It's about building bridges, not walls, especially when it comes to something as complex and globally interconnected as the automotive industry. This isn't just about a single headline or a single deal. It's a snapshot of a much larger, ongoing story about how countries are positioning themselves in the new energy economy. It's about the tension between global cooperation and nationalistic protectionism. And it's about whether the promise of electric vehicles will truly become a reality for everyone, or if it will remain a niche for those who can afford the upfront cost and navigate the current infrastructure challenges. It's a conversation that's far from over, and it's one that will continue to shape our world for decades to come. Makes you think, doesn't it?